5-year journey to teach myself the ins and outs of some of those disciplines enough to be credible in writing about them. And that was really important to me, that scientists would find what I was saying credible. They didn't necessarily have to agree with my argument, but I wanted to have a firm foundation. My training as someone in the humanities that I brought to this project was the emphasis on synthesizing findings from different fields that don't often talk to each other. They've been doing amazing research in these areas, but they haven't been talking to each other. So this book is about synthesizing findings that can help us as be more effective teachers. I also include a lot of stories of really amazing teachers in there as well. So as I was digging through the research to write that book, 5 themes, 5 ideas, 5 kind of fundamental principles of how people learn kept emerging to the surface of that research. And I have them all listed here, but I'm really going to focus on one of them: curiosity, sociality, emotion, authenticity, and failure. They're all important, and we're seeing them all at this time. I was leading a session for some faculty at a university on Tuesday, and they had a lot of questions about authenticity. How can we create authentic assignments and utilize authentic topics during this transition to remote learning? So all of them are present and even heightened, but I really want to focus on emotion. And I'm just going to run very briefly through what we know about the connections between emotion and cognition, our cognitive abilities, and then make a bridge into what we can learn from that for our current circumstances, and then talk about sociality very quickly, and then wrap up for Q&A. So for a long time, for decades, many decades actually, if you start to dig through the research, psychologists and other scientists were debating which comes first, thinking or feeling, emotion or cognition. And they battled sort of back and forth. In fact, in the 80s, there was one kind of heated battle between 2 psychologists, one feeling very strongly that cognition precedes emotion, and the other very strongly feeling the opposites, and they just kept responding to each other in the pages of one particular journal. Fortunately, we've now moved beyond that debate because what most psychologists and biologists have shown us now are that there are parts of our brain that are responsible for emotion and cognition that interact and need each other in order to function. And then there are other parts that are that are operating kind of simultaneously as we utilize some of our cognitive abilities to understand our emotions and prime our emotions in order to heighten our cognitive abilities. So essentially, we now think of emotion and cognition, and this is the metaphor I use in the book, as dance partners following the same choreography. One supports the other, and together they work to maximize each other. So when we prime our emotions, especially when we prime positive emotions, we can perform those cognitive tasks more effectively. We can understand our emotions more effectively by means of our cognition. So they work together. They work hand in hand. And a lot of the research really does show, and this is sort of happens in different corners of the literature, but it really does show the more we can prime positive emotions, the better our students can learn. And so what's a positive emotion? Well, enthusiasm, happiness, joy, feeling cared for. There's a whole literature on, and this is what I think is especially relevant at this time with our transition to remote teaching. There's a whole literature on if students feel that instructors care about them as learners and as people, they learn more effectively. And part of that is truly an emotional response. By priming that emotion, they're more attuned to what you're asking them to do. They buy into the work that we're asking them to do more because they trust us, and they're willing to take on more challenging cognitive tasks, more challenging work, more rigorous work, because they believe that that those instructors care about their progress and their learning. So priming those emotions can really heighten the work that they can do in our classroom. So the happier they feel, right? And these are things that they're small things that we can do too, right? Simply being enthusiastic about teaching, about our subject matter, can have a positive effect emotionally and cognitively on students in our classroom. Using names in the classroom, right? Another very simple thing that communicates to students that we care about them as learners in our community of learners. And even if we have big classes, we can at least use table tense. And I'm thinking there in normal face-to-face circumstances. So there are small things we can do, but in general, what the research overwhelmingly shows is emphasizing, priming those positive emotions helps with learning. Now, the other side of the coin, and this is equally relevant, is that there's other research to show that when someone's emotional response hits a point beyond which they can regulate it, their cognitive capacity kind of shuts down, right? So I'll say that again. When someone reaches a point where their emotional response surpasses their ability to regulate it, the cognitive function tends to shut down. Now, there are good biological reasons for that. We wouldn't want to assess and debate every emotional response that we're having, right? And so our brain creates this shortcut that when an emotional response gets too high, the thinking process shuts down, right? Now, that can happen with any emotion, right? We typically talk about it with negative emotions, and that's what I'll focus on in a second. But it's important to note that this kind of tipping of the scales can happen with any emotional response. So if a student finds out that she got into the med school of her dreams right before she walks into class, probably not do it. It's probably affecting the ability to learn in that class, right? But we primarily think about this phenomenon in terms of negative emotions, and this is definitely something that we know students are going through right now. So when negative emotions like stress and sadness, anxiety reach a peak, their ability to do the work for our courses diminishes considerably. And so it's not our one thing we have to understand as faculty is if that is happening, no learning can really occur until the emotional response has been mitigated. But it's not our responsibility as individual faculty to be clinical psychologists and mitigate that emotional response, right? We have to be aware of it. We need to help students find resources to work through those emotional responses, the psychological impact of what's happening right now in the world and in their lives. But we as individual faculty, unless we have a degree in clinical psychology, cannot, nor probably should not, be doing that work ourselves. We need to understand it though, and understand the implications for that students' work in our course and how we ourselves design our coursework. So as in that period where every university was moving to remote learning environment, one message that many were sending, rooted in this research, was, okay, first thing we have to think about is how much content and assignments do we actually need to meet the learning goals? Because students' emotional responses are going to be off the charts, and that's going to lead to a kind of cognitive load, or it's going to impact the cognitive load in such a way that we need to design our courses to help them manage that, right? And so trimming down our workload to the bare bones necessity for what they need to actually engage in to fulfill the learning goals is going to be really important. flexible deadlines, understanding that students can't always be there for synchronous elements of a course. So flexibility in general is what I'm getting at there. Is also really important in designing a learning experience to accommodate for the fact that emotions and psychological distress are high at this point, and when they're at that fever pitch for an extended period of time, they can't do the work in an optimal way that we have laid out anyway. And so we need to design our courses understanding that. At the same time, many faculty are experiencing these things too. And so we need to cut ourselves a break, that if we're not writing a great novel or doing a million articles or even giving necessarily 110% of ourselves to the cognitive work of our position, that's okay, and that's to be expected, and that is something that is simply a biological response to what's happening right now. So that's kind of the thrust of what I wanted to talk about today. Oops, didn't want to do that though. I wanted to briefly mention sociality too, because this is something that's coming up a lot in what I'm hearing on my own campus and beyond. Sociality, very simply, is our social nature as human beings. We are a deeply social species. We need other people, and our learning is no different from that. Prior to this all happening, one of the key elements that was debated in learning circles about online education was social presence. It is a predictor of success in online courses. It simply means the degree to which students feel as if they are a part of a learning community, interacting with other people, that the higher that social presence is, the more likely students are to succeed in the courses. I think there are no easy answers to this, but it is an issue that I'm seeing coming up over and over again with the transition to this. The reason it's not an easy answer is because on the one hand, it's tempting then to build a lot of synchronous elements into our courses so they can interact with us, interact with each other. On the other hand, though, an equity-minded approach to this transition pushes us towards asynchronous elements, because with all of the courses students are now juggling in this new environment and all the things that life is bringing to them, they may not be able to get on at a specific time to complete those synchronous elements. And so one of the sort of happy medium there, the middle ground that I think addresses some of the social presence issues while maintaining a learning environment that can be successful for the widest range of students, is perhaps building in optional synchronous elements. Also communicating as an instructor as much as possible with students, even in a fully asynchronous course that helps them to feel as part of a community. I will also say that it's possible to collaborate in an asynchronous environment. Google Docs, social media, discussion forums, even email listservs. I remember back in the days when I was a student and those were brand new, that they allow collaboration in an asynchronous environment. It's a way to heighten the social presence without building mandatory synchronous elements. So that doesn't have to do with emotion necessarily, although those two, sociality and emotion, are very closely linked together. But I did want to mention it because I've been seeing a lot of issues connected to sociality over the last few weeks. So with that, I'll stop at this point. Actually, I'll stop sharing my screen too, and I'll just open up for Q&A.
You mentioned reaching that peak when it comes to the emotions, and how they almost, emotion and cognition, would work opposite one another. So the higher that emotional response, the lower the cognition and the it will impact the cognitive load and how much the learners can understand. What strategies would you use to bring them more in a balanced way? So how would you balance the two? What are some things that you could sort of strategies, be it in a classroom environment or in a clinical setting?
Right. Well, yes. I mean, I think part of it has to do with just understanding that it's happening, or that it's possible that it's happening, and being able to point students to the right resources. Now, not every emotional response rises to that level, but being aware as a faculty member, and even noting, sometimes something like this we can observe because maybe a really great student hasn't been coming to class, or is falling asleep in class, or is responding differently in some way, and we can just kind of talk to them after class, or send an email saying, is everything okay, that kind of thing. But being aware of it, really important. How do we put them more in balance? I think in other ways, well, I think knowing your students and really kind of engaging with them frequently. The more we can engage with them, the more we know them as people and engage with them as people, the more we can sense and have a handle, I think, on what's happening in our classroom. If we don't, we may not ever know that anything is going on. I think, a lot of people have been talking about trauma-informed teaching, and I think that's really important at this time.
Yeah.
I think that this connects to your question, though, because a lot of what's come up in those discussions is, well, should we have students write an essay about how they're feeling about this experience, or should we somehow engage with them about how they're processing this? And on the one hand, to a certain point, that can be really useful. What the research says about teaching through crises is that you should never ignore the situation. You have to at least acknowledge as a group that this is happening and that we're all going to get through it together, etc. And you can even, back to authenticity, you can even use the current situation as a research topic or fodder somehow for the work of the course. On the other hand, though, if you start, you have to be very careful, because if you start to, for example, if you ask them to write an essay about it, they may get into emotional territory that you aren't able to help them with, right? And so being very careful and intentional, especially at this time, about how you access or how you utilize topics with significant emotional resonance. I think that's probably the best advice for what we're dealing with right now.
Yeah, that's a good point. What other questions do we have?
So it's Susan McDonald here. I'll ask something. So I'm my role is one of my roles is academic advisor in student affairs office, and as such there are two of us, and we meet with students usually when they are directed and told they must meet with us after a term or a course failure or similar, where they've been identified as having struggles, and we reassure them that this is not punitive, this is our due diligence to make sure how we can help them. In any event, the group, the personal counselors, career counselors, and academic advisors have been asked to sort of put out almost an Instagram or social media account with some, little points on that. And just listening to that, to this, I'm just wondering if there were if you were actually talking to the students about this, are there sort of key points you would sort of say on how this is about this,
Right.
just to help them in the sense of, this is what they're asking us to do, is to put up this little social media Instagram thing. So key points on this aspect.
Yeah, the two things that we're certainly seeing at my university, and I know that others are experiencing too, that connect to this. One is that we need to send messages to students to communicate with their faculty when things are getting overwhelming, right? I just saw a communication from a meeting that our student government had with key players here, and they were saying that students are really reluctant to communicate with faculty about anything related to this. And so they will get to the point where they're ready to break before they will say anything at all. And so I think the more that we can help students understand that it's not only okay, but it's beneficial for them to let faculty know what's happening with them, right? That if a parent or a relative or they themselves get sick, we need to know that, and that we can work with them when we know what's going on with them. But I think that students are at least from what I've seen, are very reluctant to communicate. So if we could send that message to them, that would be great. Another thing that's also related to this is students are struggling with the workload, both for two reasons. One is because many of them may not have taken online courses before and are now struggling with the kind of time management and what it means to constantly be doing all coursework through typing and through Zoom and everything that brings in terms of cognitive load. But also that some faculty, to compensate, have been adding assignments or shifting due dates and deadlines and things like that. And I know that's not everyone, but I think it's probably happening in places that we might not even be aware of it. And so students are really struggling with the workload. And that is also something that people need to hear about, right? And so I think that's another communication issue, but that's a very specific communication issue, because I guess if I were writing that message to students, I would say, are you feeling stress about the amount of work that you're doing in this learning environment, and talking to them about communicating that to their faculty. I think, and this is true of myself too, that in moving from a face-to-face environment to a remote learning environment, changes have to be made, but having never done that before, that specific transition, it's difficult to gauge the differences in workload that may need to happen because of the transition. And so faculty might not even be aware that by not changing anything, they've actually added stress, right? And so I think that communicating that to students would be really helpful too.
That's a good question.
Thank you.
It's interesting how, and you mentioned that several times, Josh, that keeping that balance. I mean, you want to communicate that these are stressful times and there is a lot of uncertainty and there is increased pressure, but you also want to do that in a lighthearted kind of way so that you don't scare people away and that they know that there are supports available. And what are those supports?
Yes, exactly. And so, just mentioning, maybe even as if you're doing weekly emails to students, highlighting a particular resource, that happens to be on campus, just as a part of the announcements, not saying anyone even necessarily needs them, but by framing it as, okay, I'm going to highlight a resource every week, that at least broaches the subject without dwelling on it, like you're saying.
And I know, today the focus was on the emotion as a key primer for other functionalities. But I wonder if you could maybe just briefly touch upon the other components in that sort of key framework.
Oh, right. Well, the curiosity, that's the one that I think, if anything is to fall by the wayside a little bit, it might be, how are we designing assignments to heighten that? We're in an emergency situation. In an ideal world, that's what we want to do, because that's how people most fundamentally learn new things. But
Mm-hmm.
the ones that I've seen come up more often, the question of authenticity, especially for those who teach STEM courses and visual and performing arts courses, which are, so the STEM courses, obviously the question there is, students used to be in a lab and now they can't be in a lab. And so how do you maintain some of the same authenticity
Mm-hmm.
in that sense? And the same is true for the arts. My wife is faculty in visual arts. And so it's very different trying to teach students how to draw via Zoom than it is being able to walk right up to their, walk right up and help them.
Mm-hmm.
So some of what we've been talking about there is the research on simulations and how those can be just as authentic in terms of the learning experience as it's different. But in terms of what the brain needs cognitively, it's a similar degree of authenticity to being in the lab. And so there's really interesting research out there on surgeons, or at least medical students who are training to be surgeons, some who trained on cadavers and some who trained in simulations only. And the research kind of follows them into their career as surgeons. And the number of errors that are made are either the same or less for those who are in the simulation environment rather than the cadaver environment. And so that I think speaks really importantly to the kind of work you can do in the simulation. You just have to imagine the learning differently than you would if they're actually in the lab. So that's come up a lot, as has the question of how do I build information, or how do I design assignments that allow students to somehow use what is currently happening with the pandemic to advance the learning goals of the course. So that kind of authenticity has come up. And then of course, failure is a topic that has come up over and over again, right? How do we, everything from grades and universities moving to pass fail and what that means, and to student work and their best efforts, and how can we de-emphasize, especially in this environment, how can we de-emphasize evaluation so that they can just feel more freedom and less pressure to get everything right away, and to just be thinking about how can I do this, make an effort, get feedback, fail, and try again in ways that will help them. And then, of course, there are our own struggles and failures, right? The first message I was trying to send to our faculty is things are going to mess up. The technology is going to glitch. The assignment that you really liked in the face-to-face environment may not work. And so we had to go easy on ourselves and free ourselves up to change things on the fly if what we originally intended isn't working. So that's something that has definitely been a part of the discussions that I've been having.
Yeah, that's excellent. That's really helpful. Well, thank you very much, Josh. I appreciate your time and your willingness to come and share some elements of your research, and actually making us want to read more and find out more about all the different components that impact student learning. And it's interesting what you said, how some are actually highlighted and are at the forefront right now in the pandemic, and others are sort of at the wayside and will sort of work in tandem and sort of peaking and then going down, and then depending on how we feel emotionally, depending on what's happening in our environment and all the stressors and the pressures that we are experiencing. So I'd like to thank you again. I'd like to thank everyone for taking half an hour of their day and joining us. And I'm seeing some comments as well of people in the chat thanking you, and an upsurge in the sales. Absolutely, I know. I've stocked quite a few of your books myself. Thank you, Josh. Thanks again, and all the best. And thank you, everyone, for joining us this month. And what we have coming up next are 2 webinars on supporting your graduate students by Dr. Lean Postovit, head of DBMS, and another one on preparing your teaching dossier. And there will be 2 other webinars that are being scheduled on clinical teaching. So I hope you can join us for those ones as well. Enjoy the rest of the day.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.